The night before the will was signed, my stepmother swung first. Her ring split my lip in the parking lot behind Northbridge Dynamics, and I let the blood drip onto the concrete like punctuation. She thought no one saw, but she was wrong. The company lawyer had his dash cam pointed straight at us. By morning, she'd learn what I do for a living. I don't fight back. I audit. My name is Avery Quinn. I am 32 years old, and my official title is Director of Internal Controls for Northbridge Dynamics. At 10:47 p.m., in the subterranean parking garage of our corporate headquarters, that title meant nothing. The air in the garage was thick and cool, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the faint, lingering exhaust of the day's departures. A fine mist, more atmosphere than rain, had followed me down the ramp from the streets of Greyhaven, clinging to my coat and beating on the polished hoods of the executive fleet. The only sounds were the incessant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the rhythmic drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe into a dark, oily puddle. It was a sterile, forgotten space after hours, a concrete ribcage beneath the gleaming glass and steel of the company my father built. I had just secured my laptop, the soft click of the magnetic latch echoing in the quiet. The emergency audit of the quarterly expense ledger had taken me 12 straight hours, a deep dive into a sea of numbers that felt wrong, like a current pulling sideways just beneath the surface. My eyes were raw, my shoulders a knot of tension, but the data was finally logged, encrypted, and backed up to the cloud. The work was done. She was waiting for me, Mara Voss, my stepmother, the company's interim executive vice president. She didn't emerge from the shadows. She was part of them, leaning against a massive concrete support pillar as if she'd been poured from the same mold. Her silhouette was sharp, framed by the sickly yellow light, even from 50 feet away. Her eyes were visible, 2 points of cold, polished steel fixed on me. As I approached, the details sharpened. The severe cut of her graphite gray suit, the immaculate blonde hair pulled into a tight chignon, the utter stillness of her posture. She was a predator conserving energy. I stopped a few feet from my sedan, my keys a cold weight in my hand. I didn't speak. In our world, the first to speak often lost leverage. She pushed off the pillar, her movements fluid and deliberate. The sound of her heels on the sealed concrete was like the clicking of a timer. "It's over, Avery," she murmured, her voice a low vibration that didn't carry. It was meant only for me. "Tomorrow morning, the will is signed. Your father is finally doing what's best for the company." I met her gaze, keeping my own expression a blank sheet of paper. What's best for the company is rarely so simple. "Oh, but it is," she countered, closing the remaining distance between us. I could smell her perfume now, something expensive and floral trying to mask the metallic scent of ambition. "He's leaving control to someone who can handle it, someone who isn't sentimental," she smiled, a faint, cruel curve of her lips. "You have no place here anymore." The blow came without warning. It wasn't a slap. It was a punch, a calculated strike with her right hand, timed for maximum impact and surprise. The force of it snapped my head to the side. The primary point of contact wasn't her knuckles, but the large, square-cut ruby on her ring. It was a gaudy thing my father had given her last Christmas. The stone's sharp corner caught my lower lip, splitting the skin instantly. A flash of white-hot pain, then a spreading, numbing warmth. I tasted blood, coppery and sharp, mixing with the lingering taste of stale coffee. The air filled with the smells of hot rubber from a recently parked car and the sudden, undeniable scent of my own blood. I didn't raise a hand. I didn't flinch back. My training, my entire professional life, was about absorbing data, not deflecting force. Retaliation was messy, emotional, and left too much to interpretation. Evidence was clean. So I stood there, letting the shock ripple through me and dissipate. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my head back to face her. I tilted my chin down just enough for the welling blood to gather and fall. A single, dark red droplet landed with a soft splash in the puddle by my feet. For a moment, It swirled on the oily surface, a crimson vortex marring the perfect, distorted reflection of the Northbridge Dynamics logo from the sign on the far wall, an exclamation point to her statement. That's when I heard it, a sound so quiet it was almost imperceptible beneath the hum of the lights, a tiny, mechanical click. It was the sound of a device activating. My eyes, without moving my head, darted to the left, parked 3 spaces down, angled perfectly towards us, was a black Lincoln Navigator, the company car assigned to Caleb Dorn, our corporate counsel, and on its dashboard, mounted just below the rearview mirror, was a small, cylindrical dash cam. Its lens was pointed directly at us. Mara saw nothing. Her breath was coming in short, satisfied huffs, her chest rising and falling. The flush of victory was on her cheeks. She believed this was a raw, unseen moment of familial dominance in a concrete tomb. I finally spoke, my voice steady, though my lip throbbed with a dull, heavy beat. "Thank you," I said, the words slightly slurred by the swelling, "for confirming the coercion clause yourself." Confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by renewed contempt. She didn't understand the words, but she understood she had lost control of the narrative. With a disgusted hiss, she turned and walked away, her heels striking the ground with sharp, angry reports that echoed through the garage. She didn't look back. As soon as her footsteps faded up the ramp, I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I switched to the front-facing camera, angled my face to catch the light, and took a clear, high-resolution photograph of my split lip. The metadata would automatically embed the exact time and GPS coordinates. 10:49 p.m., Northbridge Dynamics parking garage, level P2. I saved the image to a secure folder, codenamed Quince. Then, I looked back towards Caleb's car. From my angle, I could just make out a minuscule point of light on his dashcam, a tiny, blinking red dot. The silent, impartial witness, the one that never lied, never forgot, and never took sides. It just recorded the truth, and the truth was all I ever needed. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine off, the silence of the garage pressing in. The throb in my lip was a dull, rhythmic metronome, counting down the seconds until dawn. I didn't touch it. I simply observed the sensation, logging it as another data point in a long and increasingly damning file. This company, Northbridge Dynamics, was my father's life's work, and it was rotting from the head down. To the outside world, to the readers of the Greyhaven Business Journal and the shareholders who clipped their quarterly dividend checks, Northbridge Dynamics was a paragon of modern logistics. We were the city's corporate darling, a behemoth of efficiency and reliability. Our annual reports were glossy masterpieces of positive spin, filled with photos of smiling, diverse employees and charts with aggressively optimistic upward curves. Our internal stock, held by the senior partners and my family, was the bedrock of a dozen fortunes. As stable and unexciting as the concrete pillars surrounding me, we didn't just move cargo, we projected an image of unshakable integrity. It was a beautiful, expensive, and exquisitely crafted lie. The rot began, as it so often does, with a moment of weakness, a year ago. My father, Graham Quinn, the founder and the beating heart of the company, had a minor stroke. He was a man who had built an empire from 2 trucks and a leased warehouse, a titan whose voice could command a boardroom and calm a union dispute with equal authority. The stroke didn't kill him, but it chipped away at his foundations. His speech slowed, his memory developed frustrating gaps, and the iron certainty in his eyes was replaced by a fog of confusion that would drift in without warning. He was still there, but he was diminished, a king ruling over a kingdom he could no longer fully survey. Into that power vacuum stepped Mara. She had been my father's second wife for 5 years, a polished, ambitious woman who had always seemed more interested in his portfolio than his personality. With my father sidelined, she emerged as his savior, his designated savior. She invoked his name in every memo as she began her crusade of restructuring. That was her preferred euphemism. She cut entire departments she deemed redundant, mostly those staffed by employees who had been loyal to my father for decades. She streamlined operations, which meant squeezing suppliers and leveraging contracts until they bled. She cultivated a public image as a iron-willed leader, a no-nonsense executive making the tough calls my ailing father no longer could. The board, cowed by her aggression and reassured by the short-term cost savings, appointed her interim EVP. They praised her strength. I saw only opportunism, a vulture circling a wounded lion. My position was unique. As Director of Internal Controls, I was a creature of numbers, not politics. My job was to be the company's conscience, its immune system, the dispassionate verifier of facts. Mara couldn't fire me without it looking like a blatant power grab. My father had created the department and appointed me himself, praising my brutal honesty, so Mara kept me, but she neutralized me. For the sake of appearances, Avery, she'd said in a board meeting, her voice dripping with false sympathy, it would be a conflict of interest for you to sit on the executive council while your father's health is in flux. The board members nodded sagely. It was a brilliant move, framing her nepotistic paranoia as a matter of good corporate governance. I was allowed to see the books, but I was barred from the room where the books were discussed. It was in those books, in the deep, unglamorous strata of the company's finances, that I first smelled smoke. It was a whisper of a rumor at first, a ghost in the spreadsheets. The Sycamore Fund. It didn't officially exist. There was no line item, no budget code, but its fingerprints were everywhere. A series of payments to new, unvetted contractors for consulting services, invoices that were always round numbers, always split into smaller amounts that fell just below the threshold requiring senior executive approval, a slow, steady hemorrhage of capital disguised as operational expenses. It was a classic shell game, a pipeline siphoning money from the company's arteries, and I suspected it led directly to an account Mara controlled. The impending signing of the will was the catalyst that had brought everything to a head. My father, in a moment of rare lucidity a month ago, had called his attorneys at Harbor & Finch LLP. He wanted a new will. He told me about it one afternoon. His voice soft but firm, the fog having momentarily lifted. He wanted to divide his controlling shares equally between Mara and me, but with a critical addition, an ironclad clause protecting the jobs of all employees with over 20 years of service. It was his way of atoning for Mara's purges, of preserving the soul of his company. We were scheduled to sign it tomorrow morning. But Mara knew about the old will, the one drafted 3 years ago, before the stroke. That version contained a clause that was standard at the time, but had become terrifyingly relevant. In the event of his death or incapacitation, his shares and voting rights would fall under the full control of his spouse. Provided they were serving in an executive capacity, it would give her everything. All she had to do was stop the new will from being signed. My suspicion had been growing for months, solidifying with each new piece of data. I started cross-referencing Mara's expense reports with my father's medical charts. A pattern emerged. On the day in March when he was hospitalized for severe dehydration, Mara signed an emergency logistics contract with a shell corporation based in Delaware. When he had a fall in May, she approved a massive, vaguely defined market research expenditure. She was using his moments of crisis as cover for her theft. I tried to follow the money, but my efforts were constantly, almost politely, thwarted. Every time I opened a formal audit ticket on one of the suspect vendors, the director of the relevant department would coincidentally go on an unscheduled vacation, making it impossible to get the necessary physical authorizations. The system was working against me, its gears clogged by her influence. On the surface, we were the perfect corporate family, the strong, ailing patriarch, the fierce, capable wife holding the business together, the quiet, diligent daughter, keeping the books. It was a narrative Mara sold to the board, to the press, to my father himself. But beneath the polished veneer, we were a toxic balance sheet, and in the middle of it all, between the assets and the liabilities, was a gaping human-shaped hole where the truth was supposed to be. The blood on my lip was just the final entry, the interest payment on a debt of lies and greed that was about to come due. The drive home was on autopilot. My mind wasn't on the wet, shimmering streets of Greyhaven or the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. It was back in the digital labyrinth of Northbridge's servers. The physical sting on my lip was a grounding reality, a stark confirmation of what the numbers had been whispering for months. Mara was not just greedy, she was desperate. And desperation leaves a trail. Back in my apartment, I didn't bother with ice for my face. Pain was a low-priority variable. I went straight to my personal workstation, a secure, air-gapped system completely disconnected from the Northbridge network, and began to assemble the narrative the data had given me. My real audit hadn't ended when I logged off at the office. That was just the prologue. The hunt for the Sycamore Fund had started as an anomaly search. I built a script to flag payments that met a specific, unusual profile, non-sequential invoice numbers, perfectly round dollar amounts, and a payment date within 48 hours of submission. Normal corporate expenses are messy. They end in cents. They queue for approval. They have traceable purchase orders. These were different. They were too clean. The script returned a swarm of transactions, all small enough, just under the $10,000 threshold, to be approved by a mid-level director without EVP oversight. It was a carefully constructed deception, 1,000 tiny cuts bleeding the company dry instead of a single, obvious stab wound. I traced the digital approvals for these payments. They were all authorized by legitimate director-level accounts, but the timestamps were always outside of business hours, usually in the dead of night. That was my first red flag. My second, and the one that blew the door open, was the IP address. Every single one of the dozens of fraudulent approvals originated from the same internal IP, 10.1.1.1 says. I ran the address against the company's network schematic. It wasn't assigned to an office or a server. It was hardwired to an Ethernet port in a room on the 4th floor designated Wellness Room, a corporate fad from the previous year. It had been a quiet space with yoga mats and a tea station, intended to promote employee mindfulness. The initiative was a failure, and the room had been officially decommissioned, stripped of its furniture, and locked for the past 9 months. A forgotten, dusty room was the ghost in our machine. I pulled the access logs for the 4th floor service corridor. There it was, in crisp, undeniable data. A keycard belonging to Mara's executive assistant, a young, ambitious sycophant named Liam, had been used to access that corridor at 2:13 a.m., 3 times a week, for the last 6 months. A phantom was haunting the wellness room, approving payments in the dark. The money itself flowed to a handful of newly established LLCs. They had generic names like Apex Logistical Solutions and Keystone Consulting Group, but when I ran the registration data through a public records database, I found the connecting tissue. The primary beneficiary for Apex was a man whose last name was Barrow. A week before the payments to Apex began, Mara had personally promoted a new project director in our Western Division. His name was Simon Barrow. It wasn't proof, but in an audit, coincidences are just unconfirmed correlations. The final piece of the physical puzzle came from the vehicle logs. A series of invoices from Keystone were for client entertainment and transport. The invoices were vague, listing no clients, no destinations, just a flat fee. But the GPS trackers on our corporate sedans told a different story. On the nights corresponding to those invoices, a car from the executive pool would leave the Northbridge garage and travel to a self-storage facility in an industrial park on the outskirts of Greyhaven. It would idle there for exactly 15 minutes before returning. No clients were ever entertained at Haven Storage 12. With the pattern established, the architecture of the fraud laid bare, it was time to move from passive observation to active engagement. It was time to set a trap. I drafted a new invoice within our accounting system. I created a fake vendor, Acorn Procurement, a subtle, ironic nod to the Sycamore Fund. The invoice was for $9,850 for expedited shipping pallet procurement, a plausible but ultimately unverifiable service. I embedded a digital tracker in the PDF, a tiny pixel that would ping a private server of mine the moment the file was opened. Then, I submitted it into the system, a single piece of poisoned bait dropped into the feeding frenzy. I didn't have to wait long. The system was designed for efficiency, and Mara had turned that efficiency into a weapon. 2 hours and 14 minutes after I submitted the Acorn invoice, my private server pinged. The invoice had been opened. 10 minutes after that, a notification popped up in the Northbridge accounting portal. Invoice AP774 from Acorn Procurement had been approved for payment. I dove into the approval log. This was the moment that mattered. It wasn't Liam's credentials that had approved this payment. It wasn't Simon Barrow's. The approval had been executed using a temporary cryptographic signature, a single-use authorization token. According to company IT policy, a policy that Mara herself had signed off on, the power to generate such a token was restricted to one role, the acting executive vice president. She had been in such a hurry. The system she'd built to steal had become so automated that she hadn't bothered to use one of her proxies. She had signed it herself, digitally, with a key only she could possess. It was the equivalent of leaving a signed confession on the murder weapon. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I initiated a full data dump of the relevant server logs, the IP history from the wellness room, the keycard access records for the 4th floor, the vehicle GPS logs, the Sycamore-linked payment histories, and the final, beautiful approval of the honeypot invoice, complete with the EVP token signature. The download took 11 minutes, the longest 11 minutes of my life. Once the data was secure on my local drive, I ran a cryptographic hash function, SHA-256, reducing the entire multi-gigabyte folder of evidence into a single, unique 64-character string. It was a digital fingerprint. If even a single byte of the original data were to be altered, the hash would change completely. It was immutable proof. I encrypted the data folder, then uploaded the encrypted container to a digital vault I maintained with Harbor and Finch, my father's law firm. It was an arrangement I'd set up months ago. A legal black box. I then composed a new email. To Caleb Dorn, subject, Quince. The body of the email contained only the 64-character SHA-256 hash string, a digital copy of the key to the entire conspiracy. Finally, I picked up my phone and sent him a text message. My thumb was steady. The message was short. A contingency plan for the violence that had just occurred. Caleb, if something happens to me tonight, you have my authorization. Open the Quince box. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors painting pale light on my face, the smell of smoke, the kind you notice just before the fire alarms go off, had been choking the company for a year. Mara thought she was a master arsonist, setting small, controlled burns to cover her tracks, but she didn't realize she was dealing with a forensic accountant. My job wasn't to fight the fire. It was to document the point of origin, identify the accelerant, and hand a perfect, undeniable report to the people who would put her in chains, and that report was now complete. Caleb Dorn was the quietest man at Northbridge Dynamics. In a company of brash salesmen and aggressive executives, he was a pale, unassuming presence, a man who seemed to blend into the beige walls of his own office. He wore sensible suits, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression of perpetual, mild distraction, but that gentle exterior was a form of camouflage. Caleb was the only senior employee who owed nothing to Mara. My father had hired him straight out of law school 15 years ago, and his loyalty was not to any single person, but to the legal entity of the company itself, its bylaws, its charter, its very soul. He was the corporate immune system, and he had just detected a pathogen. His pretext for being there was a masterclass in bureaucratic subtlety. A recent memo, authored by him, had been circulated to all senior staff regarding a statistical increase in minor vehicle collisions in the P2 garage. To expedite insurance claims and determine liability, the legal department was testing several models of dash-mounted recording devices in company vehicles. It was a perfectly plausible, utterly boring explanation that no one would question. In reality, Caleb had been watching Mara's escalating aggression for months. He hadn't been testing cameras, he had been laying a trap. He stepped out from behind the concrete pillar next to his navigator, moving with a silence that was almost unnerving. He didn't startle me. I had been aware of his presence from the moment I heard the camera click on. He wasn't in the shadows. He was simply in a place I hadn't been meant to look. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't ask if I was all right. His eyes met mine, flicked down to my bleeding lip, and then returned to my face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation. I saw, it is recorded, it is real. That one small gesture was more valuable to me than 1,000 words of sympathy. It was a data point, verified by a credible source. I waited for him to speak. He was methodical, never rushing his actions. He walked to his vehicle, opened the driver's side door, and carefully dismounted the small camera from its bracket. He didn't fumble. His hands were as steady as a surgeon's. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice low and even, not carrying in the cavernous space. 8 o'clock, 19th floor conference room. He paused, looking directly at me. "Don't come alone." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. He meant for me to bring my father's lawyers, the ones from Harbor and Finch. This was no longer an internal matter. "Whose side are you on, Caleb?" I asked, my voice a bit thick from the swelling. He didn't hesitate. "The side of the evidence," he said it simply, as a statement of unchangeable fact, like stating the boiling point of water. It was the most reassuring thing he could have possibly said. He turned to the back of his vehicle and opened the tailgate. Inside was a briefcase, and from it, he removed not a USB drive, but the camera's entire SD card. He then produced a clear, heavy-duty plastic pouch, a formal evidence bag. It had a section for logging a description, date, and signatures, and a tamper-evident adhesive seal across the top. He was prepared. This wasn't a coincidence. He dropped the SD card into the bag. He then pressed a small, integrated button on the bag's label. A tiny digital display flickered to life, showing the current date and time, now permanently burned into the label's screen, a timestamp that could never be altered. He had created a perfect, self-contained piece of evidence, its chain of custody beginning in this exact moment. He held the bag and a pen out to me. "Sign across the seal." I took the pen. My hand was rock steady. I leaned the bag against the cool metal of his car's tailgate and signed my initial, a small, sharp Q, right where the plastic of the flap would meet the adhesive strip. As I finished the stroke, I lifted my head, and a tiny, almost invisible smear of blood from my lip transferred from my skin onto the white paper of the label. It was right next to my signature. Caleb's eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. He looked at the red-brown smudge, then back at me. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a deep professional satisfaction, crossed his face. Our evidence now had video. It had a timestamp. It had a witness. And now, it had my DNA. It was legally pristine, airtight. He sealed the bag, the adhesive bonding with a quiet finality. He placed it carefully back into his briefcase and locked it with a small key. "I will see you at 8, he said, then closed the tailgate, walked to his driver's side door, got in, and drove away without another word. The red of his taillights bled into the darkness of the ramp and then vanished. I stood there for another minute, the metallic taste in my mouth a constant reminder of the transaction that had just taken place. Mara saw this as a family drama, a vicious little spat over an inheritance. She was thinking about emotion, about dominance, about putting her uppity stepdaughter in her place. She couldn't see the reality of what she had done. I saw it for what it was, a felony. In the context of the will signing, her assault was not a domestic issue. It was a textbook case of coercion and witness intimidation. When combined with the financial fraud I had spent months uncovering, it formed a pattern of criminal behavior that went far beyond family squabbles. It was corporate malfeasance. It was a conspiracy to defraud. She thought she had won a skirmish in a private war. In truth, she had just handed me the legal ammunition to obliterate her entire campaign, and she'd done it on camera. The lawyer, the quiet man who saw everything, was no longer just an observer. He was now the custodian of the truth, and tomorrow morning, he was going to put it on the table. At 7:58 a.m., I pushed open the heavy glass door to the 19th floor conference room. The air inside was chilled and still, smelling of polished mahogany and industrial-strength window cleaner. 3 of the room's 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, and the morning sun was just beginning to burn the last of the fog off the city. From this height, Greyhaven was a silent map, a grid of concrete and steel where thousands of lives moved in predictable patterns. It was a system, and I was here to correct a critical error in that system. Mara was already there, seated at the head of the long, reflective table as if she were a queen holding court. She wore a severe charcoal gray dress that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her posture was impeccable, her hands folded neatly on the table's gleaming surface. I noted, with a clinical lack of surprise, that the gaudy ruby ring was gone. In its place, a small, flesh-colored adhesive bandage was wrapped around her right ring finger, a clumsy attempt to hide the weapon after the fact. Her eyes met mine as I entered, and they were as cold and flat as the glass walls surrounding us. I took a seat halfway down the table, directly opposite Caleb Dorn. He gave me that same small, confirmatory nod from the night before. Seated beside him was Mr. Sterling, a senior partner from Harbor & Finch, a man whose face was a carefully neutral mask. A few other board members, including our independent chairman, were present, their faces impassive, waiting for the proceedings to begin. At precisely 8 o'clock, the door opened again. My father, Graham Quinn, was wheeled in by his private nurse. He looked smaller in the wheelchair, his frame lost in the folds of a cashmere blanket draped over his legs, but his eyes were clear this morning, the fog at bay. He clutched a pale blue file folder in his lap like a life raft. The nurse positioned him at the opposite head of the table from Mara, a silent counterweight. "Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He opened his own leather-bound folder. "Good morning. We are gathered today for the signing of Mr. Graham Quinn's updated last will and testament, as per his instructions." Mara didn't wait for him to finish. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and commanding, intended to cut off any other possibility before it could form. "With all due respect to my husband's wishes, this is a volatile time for Northbridge. For the sake of stability and continuity, the board agrees that we should reaffirm the existing legal directives. We will proceed with the established will. There will be no changes today." She looked around the table, daring anyone to challenge her. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. She had spent a year consolidating her power, and this was her final move, a public declaration of her control. I did not look at her. I looked at Mr. Sterling. "Stability requires truth," I said, my voice calm and level. I reached into my briefcase and placed a single, sealed manila envelope on the polished surface of the table. The sound it made was a soft, definitive thud. Mara's eyes narrowed at the envelope, a flicker of annoyance in her gaze. She was about to speak again, but Caleb Dorn moved first, without a word. He rose, walked to the integrated media console at the front of the room, and inserted a small, black USB drive. He pressed a button, and the massive 8K screen on the wall, previously displaying the Northbridge Dynamics logo, flickered to black. The image that appeared was grainy, shot from a low angle through a rain-streaked windshield. It was the subterranean parking garage. The timestamp in the corner read 22:47:13. On screen, 2 figures stood in the sickly yellow light. Me and Mara. The room was utterly silent as the scene played out. We watched Mara's lips move, her unheard words hanging in the air. Then, we saw her arm swing. The microphone on the dashcam was sensitive. The sound that erupted into the sterile boardroom was shocking in its raw violence. A sharp, ugly thwack, followed by the distinct sound of my head snapping to the side. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the other board members. My father flinched, his hand tightening on his blue folder. Mara let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. Honestly, Avery, is this what this is about? A bit of family drama? You provoked me. I reacted. It's a private matter. And it has absolutely nothing to do with this will. She waved a dismissive hand at the screen, where the video showed me tilting my head, letting a drop of blood fall to the concrete. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer from Harbor and Finch, did not look at Mara. He looked at the document in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was devoid of all emotion, a precise legal instrument. On the contrary, Ms. Voss, he said, his tone chillingly mild. It has everything to do with this will. Specifically, it has to do with Article 7, Section B, of the Northbridge Dynamics Corporate Charter, which is incorporated by reference into the will you wish to uphold, as well as the new one, the clause pertaining to undue influence and coercion. He paused, letting the words settle into the room. That clause states that any attempt by a designated beneficiary to coerce, threaten, or physically intimidate another beneficiary or the testator himself within the 48-hour period leading up to the signing of a testamentary document renders that beneficiary's claims null and void. Mara's dismissive smile froze on her face. Her manicured hand, the one with the Band-Aid, had been resting on the table. It stopped moving. Her knuckles went white. Her gaze snapped from Mr. Sterling to the screen, not just looking at the image, but truly seeing it for the first time. She wasn't looking at me or at her past self anymore. She was looking at the angle of the shot, the perspective. From inside a car that had been parked there, waiting. And in that frozen moment, the carefully constructed facade of Mara Voss, the steel leader, the savvy executive, the grieving wife, cracked. The arrogant certainty in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, horrifying realization. This wasn't a lucky recording from a random security camera she could have erased. This was a witness. This was intentional, and it was the first time in her entire calculated, ruthless life that she understood that the camera, the silent, impartial observer, had been watching her all along. The trap hadn't just been sprung. She had walked into it, swung the hammer down on her own future, and signed her confession in blood. My blood. The silence that followed the lawyer's statement was a physical presence in the room, heavier than the mahogany table, colder than the glass walls. The video on the screen had frozen on my face, angled just so, the blood a dark slash against my pale skin. Mara remained motionless, a statue carved from rage and disbelief. The trap had been sprung, but she didn't yet understand the intricacy of its design. She thought she was only caught in the jaws. She had no idea the ground beneath her was about to give way. The spell was broken by a small, dry cough. It came from my father. All heads turned to him. He looked frail, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured with the pale blue folder in his lap. His voice, when he spoke, was thin, but carried a core of his old tempered steel. "Mr. Sterling," he rasped, "there is one more relevant section. Please, read Article 14 for the board, the Governance Independence Clause." Mr. Sterling, who had been waiting for this cue, nodded solemnly. He didn't look at the will in his own binder. Instead, he reached across the table and took the blue folder from my father's lap. He opened it. It did not contain a full, lengthy document. It contained a single, 2-page addendum. "This," Mr. Sterling announced to the room, "is Addendum 14B to the Northbridge Dynamics Corporate Charter, cross-referenced and legally bound to any and all testamentary documents executed by Graham Quinn. It was signed, dated, and notarized 2 weeks ago." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Mara with cold precision. The signing took place at St. Jude's Hospital, during what Ms. Voss's medical proxies had logged as a period of non-responsive sedation for Mr. Quinn. A low murmur went through the board members. Mara's face, already pale, turned ashen. "Mr. Sterling began to read, his voice a dispassionate, legal drone that methodically dismantled Mara's world. Addendum 14B, Subsection 1. In the event that any designated beneficiary or corporate officer with fiduciary duty is found to have engaged in acts of coercion, intimidation, or physical violence against another beneficiary or heir apparent in the 180 days preceding a transfer of assets, that individual shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit any and all executive authority, voting rights, and board privileges granted to them by this charter or any associated will. He let the words hang in the air. Forfeiture, not a slap on the wrist, not a censure, a complete and total corporate execution. The video of the assault was not just leverage, it was the trigger for a clause she never knew existed. But my father hadn't stopped there. Subsection 2. Mr. Sterling continued, his voice dropping slightly, as if for emphasis. Upon the triggering of subsection 1, all guardianship of corporate assets and operational control shall be transferred, effective immediately, to a temporary governance committee. The mandate of this committee is to ensure stability, conduct a full forensic review of all executive accounts, and oversee operations until a permanent successor is named. The committee shall be chaired by— He looked up from the page, and his eyes, along with every other pair in the room, landed squarely on me. The acting head of internal controls. The collective gaze of the room was a physical weight. They weren't looking at Avery Quinn, the founder's quiet daughter. They were looking at the new center of power in the company, a reality that had just been spoken into existence. I didn't smile. I didn't show any trace of triumph. I simply met the chairman's gaze and said, my voice as steady as the numbers in a ledger. I will, of course, follow the procedures outlined in the book. That's what broke her. The cold, procedural finality of it all. Mara slammed her hands on the table and shot to her feet, the chair scraping violently behind her. No! She shrieked, her voice cracking, the carefully cultivated image of the steel leader shattering into a million pieces. He was tricked, sedated. He didn't know what he was signing. This girl— She pointed a trembling, bandaged finger at me. This is a setup. She orchestrated this whole thing. Before her accusation could gain any traction, Caleb Dorn, who had been standing silently by the media console, walked back to the table. He reached into the same briefcase from last night and placed a second sealed envelope next to the first one. It was identical. He didn't speak. He simply pushed it towards Mr. Sterling. The lawyer opened it. Inside were not photos or legal documents, but a stack of computer printouts. These, Mr. Sterling said, addressing the chairman, are server logs from Northbridge Dynamics accounting system, pulled last night. They detail the approval of a fraudulent invoice, a honeypot invoice, from a shell vendor. The approval was made using a single-use EVP authorization token. He slid the top page across the table. I could see the highlighted line item from where I sat. Invoice AP 774. Acorn Procurement. Mara stared at the paper, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was a language she understood far better than legal jargon. The signature on the addendum has been verified, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice relentless. As has the timestamp, Northbridge, at Mr. Quinn's insistence 5 years ago, implemented an internal blockchain ledger for all high-level document executions. The timestamp and the digital signature on this addendum were recorded on that immutable ledger 2 weeks ago. They cannot be altered. They cannot be forged. It is, by our company's own definition, absolute proof. Mara sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her. The trap was not a single event. It was a layered masterpiece of legal and digital foresight. The video was the key. The addendum was the lock. The financial evidence was the steel that lined the walls of the vault. She finally understood. The will wasn't just about dividing my father's money and his shares. This was never about inheritance. It was a contingency plan for the survival of the company itself. A dead man's switch designed to protect the corporation from the one person my father knew might try to destroy it from within. My father turned his head slowly, his tired eyes finding mine across the long, polished table. The anger and confusion were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound clarity. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "You learned," he whispered, his voice filled with a weary pride. "You learned how to build a safe that no one can crack." While my father's words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the brutal game I had been forced to master, another, parallel narrative was reaching its climax across town. The trap I had laid in the boardroom was the public face of the execution. The work being done in the city's industrial sector was the coroner's report, detailing the precise cause of death. 20 miles away, under a sky the color of dishwater, the roll-up metal door of Haven Storage 12 screeched in protest. Detective Valerius of the Greyhaven PD's Economic Crimes Unit, a man whose weary expression suggested he'd seen every possible permutation of human greed, watched as 2 uniformed officers applied a crowbar to the lock. The warrant in his pocket was fresh, signed by a judge less than an hour ago, expedited on the basis of exigent circumstances provided by Northbridge Dynamics Corporate Counsel. The door shuttered upwards, revealing a 10 by 20-foot concrete box. The air that rolled out was stale, thick with the scent of dust and the faint, acrid smell of ozone, the kind that clings to recently run electronics. "Fan on, lights," Valerius commanded, his voice flat. His team moved with practiced efficiency. The space wasn't filled with furniture or forgotten belongings. It was a makeshift back office. A cheap folding table stood against one wall, a single laptop sitting closed upon it. Next to it was an industrial-grade paper shredder, its plastic wastebasket filled with a confetti of cross-cut documents. Valerius placed a gloved hand on the shredder's housing. It was still warm. "Too late," his partner muttered. "Panic makes people sloppy," Valerius replied, his eyes scanning the room. Stacked against the far wall were a dozen cardboard file boxes. The top one was labeled with a single, black stenciled word, "Sycamore." While one officer began carefully bagging the shredded paper as evidence, another examined the cheap electronic keypad on the unit's interior light switch. Taped to the wall beside it was a spare keycard, the kind used for secondary access points at corporate offices. "Looks like a Northbridge card. Detective? Get forensics to lift prints. I want to know who was sloppy enough to leave a spare." An hour later, the print would come back as a perfect match for Liam, Mara's executive assistant. He had been here. He had been here recently. The biggest mistake, however, was the one born of pure arrogance. Tucked on a high metal shelf, almost invisible in the gloom, was a small, cube-shaped object with a blinking green light, a self-contained, motion-activated security camera, the kind people buy online to watch their pets. It was still plugged into a portable battery pack. Its internal hard drive hadn't been pulled, let alone wiped. They had shredded the paper but forgotten the digital eye in the corner. Back in a forensics van, a tech plugged the hard drive into a reader. Files spooled onto the screen, sorted by date. He clicked on a file from the previous evening. The timestamp was 22:59. The footage was clear. Illuminated by the unit's single bare bulb, it showed Mara Voss, her face, unmistakable. She was standing in front of a man whose back was to the camera, handing him a thick manila envelope, the same kind of envelope I had placed on the boardroom table. "Get me a timestamp on that transfer," Valerius said into his radio, looking at the frozen image on the screen. The response came back moments later. The largest payment to the Apex Logistical Solutions LLC, the one linked to Simon Barrow, had been wired at 23:15, just 16 minutes after Mara had handed over the envelope. It was a direct, causal link. The payment for services rendered. The case was no longer a stack of circumstantial evidence. It was a solid, interlocking structure. The corporate driver, when questioned 2 days prior, had already provided his statement. He'd driven Ms. Voss to this location to meet with foreign clients. A quick check with the FAA confirmed no international private charters had landed at Greyhaven Executive Airport that evening. The bank statements, secured by a subpoena that morning, showed the funds from the client entertainment budget being funneled through 2 shell companies before landing in an account controlled by Keystone Consulting Group, the same group whose contractor was now the star of their new favorite home movie. In the silent, Arctic tension of the boardroom, my phone vibrated softly against the mahogany. I slid it discreetly from my pocket beneath the table. A single new text message. The sender was an encrypted number I knew belonged to Detective Valerius. The message contained just 4 words. "The package is open." It was the signal. The physical evidence was secured. The chain of custody was established. The second half of the trap had closed. I looked up from my phone, not at Mara, but at the large screen on the wall, at Caleb's quiet instruction. The video of the parking garage assault had been replaced by my own tablet's display, showing a live feed of the Northbridge financial dashboard. It was a complex web of charts and arrows, tracking cash flow across our global operations. Then it began. Mara's phone, sitting face down on the table, buzzed, a low, angry vibration. She ignored it. 5 seconds later, it buzzed again and again, a frantic, desperate cascade of notifications. Her assistant, her personal lawyer, the chairman of the bank that held the Sycamore accounts, the outside world, the world of consequences, was clawing its way through the glass walls of the 19th floor. With a choked sound of fury, she snatched the phone and jabbed a finger at the screen to silence it, then slammed it face down again, as if trying to crush an insect. I didn't watch her frantic, panicked movements. My attention was fixed on the screen. I watched as I remotely executed a command I had prepared hours before, freezing all accounts and contracts associated with the Sycamore project, citing a pending internal control investigation. On the dashboard, the green arrows of capital flow that snaked their way towards her phantom projects began to flicker. One by one, they turned a stark, clinical red. Then, they broke apart, vanishing from the screen as the flow of money was severed at its source. Her entire shadow empire, built over a year of careful theft, was being digitally dismantled in real time, right before the board's eyes. She had thought her secrets were safe, locked away in a concrete box in a forgotten part of the city, but the door to Haven Storage 12 had been thrown open, and the smell of old, curdled greed was now on the open air, for all the world to notice. The digital arrows on the financial dashboard had ceased their motion, frozen in a state of corporate cardiac arrest. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the climate control system and the frantic, muffled buzzing of Mara's phone. It was Arthur Vance, the board's independent chairman, who finally broke the spell. He was a man made of tweed and procedure, and he clung to protocol now as a drowning man clings to wreckage. "Hem," he coughed, adjusting his glasses. "In light of the evidence presented, and pursuant to the charter addendum Mr. Sterling has authenticated, I believe a formal vote is required. The motion on the floor is to invoke Article 14, subsection 1, resulting in the immediate suspension of Ms. Mara Voss from all executive duties and the activation of the Temporary Governance Committee." This was Mara's last stand. She pushed her chair back, the picture of wounded dignity, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone meant to remind them of their shared self-interest. "Arthur, let's be rational," she began, sweeping her gaze over the other board members, skipping me. "This is an ambush, a theatrical tantrum from a disgruntled child. You have all seen the numbers. I have increased shareholder value by 12% this quarter. The markets demand stability. Can you imagine the chaos, the stock plunge, if you hand this company over to her?" Her gesture in my direction was a flick of the wrist, as if shooing away a fly. "I am this company's stability. A vote against me is a vote to set fire to your own portfolios. Do not let a family spat sink this ship." It was a good performance. She appealed to their deepest instinct, greed, but she had miscalculated the variables. She thought the only things on the balance sheet were dollars and cents. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. I slid a thin folder from my briefcase. "Mr. Chairman," I said, my tone as neutral as an auditor's report. On the subject of stability, I have compiled a list of personnel terminations executed by Ms. Voss in the last 6 months that were flagged for procedural irregularity. I began to read. Robert Henderson, head of Fleet Logistics, 34 years of service, terminated for restructuring. His termination paperwork was filed 3 hours after he questioned a fuel invoice from a vendor called Keystone Consulting. His 20-year loyalty bonus, mandated by his contract, was never paid out. It was instead rerouted to a discretionary executive entertainment fund. I continued down the list, name after name, a roll call of the ghosts she had created. Eleanor Vance, payroll supervisor, 27 years of service, fired for performance issues the day after she flagged a series of split payments to an LLC named Apex Solutions. Maria Flores, acquisitions analyst. As I spoke, I could see the shift in the room. This was no longer an abstract argument about stock prices. I was giving names and faces to the collateral damage of Mara's greed. These were people the board members knew, people they had worked with for decades. The tipping point came from the most unexpected corner. Marcus Thorne, the director of overseas expansion, had always been a firm Mara ally. He was a pragmatist, and Mara's ruthless cost-cutting had made his department look good. He held up a hand, his face pale. "Avery, stop," he said, his voice strained. He turned to the chairman. "Arthur, something's happened. Last week, my wife received a text message. It was a picture of our daughter, taken outside her school." A chill went through the room that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The message just said, "Loyalty is a valuable asset. Make sure yours isn't over-leveraged." Thorne continued, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "We went to the police, but the number was from a burner phone, untraceable. I thought it was a random act, a wrong number. But hearing this now," he looked at Mara, his eyes filled with a dawning, sickening comprehension. Before Thorne even finished, Caleb Dorn was moving. He connected another device to the media console. A new image filled the screen. It was a map of Greyhaven, overlaid with a spiderweb of blue lines. "This is cell tower data, cross-referenced with vehicle GPS," Caleb stated, his voice a calm counterpoint to the rising tension. "Legally obtained. The blue line is the company car assigned to Ms. Voss's assistant, Liam. The red dot is the location of the burner phone that sent the message to Mrs. Thorne. This data shows the car and the phone traveling in tandem from Northbridge Tower to this location." The map zoomed in on the industrial park on the edge of the city. "The location is Haven Storage 12. The final gear clicked into place. The intimidation, the threats, the phantom companies. It was all one seamless, criminal enterprise." "A vote," the chairman said, his voice now grim and resolute. "By secret ballot." A clear plexiglass box was placed in the center of the table. Slips of paper were passed out. The room was silent save for the scratch of 7 pens. Each director folded their slip and walked to the head of the table, dropping it into the box. The sound of the paper hitting the plastic was soft, but in the silence, it sounded like the first drops of a coming storm, a quiet, steady rhythm marking her downfall. The chairman unlocked the box, unfolded the 7 slips, and stacked them. He did not look at Mara. "The board has voted," he announced. "The motion to invoke Article 14 is carried, 6 in favor, 1 opposed." He cleared his throat. "Ms. Voss is hereby suspended, effective immediately. Ms. Quinn is appointed chair of the Temporary Governance Committee." The words were a death sentence. The power, the control, the entire artifice she had built, evaporated in a single, procedural sentence. Mara didn't scream or protest. A strange, bitter smile twisted her lips. She finally turned her head and looked at me. Truly looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time not as a nuisance, but as the architect of her ruin. "You think this is what you wanted?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You think this is revenge?" For the first time all morning, I allowed myself to meet her gaze directly. My own expression was a blank slate, a cleared ledger. I felt no triumph, only the quiet, grim satisfaction of a complex problem solved. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly even. "This isn't revenge." I held her gaze, a direct, unfiltered connection in the silent, glass-walled room. "This is damage control." The vote was done. The words had been said, but the final punctuation of the sentence had not yet been written. It began not with a word, but with a sound that did not belong on the 19th floor. It was the rhythmic, percussive sound of hard-soled shoes on polished marble, moving with purpose down the long, glass-walled corridor. It grew steadily louder, a drumbeat of consequence approaching. Every head in the room, except for mine and Caleb's, turned towards the door. The sound stopped, a sharp rap on the glass. The chairman, looking pale and relieved to be ceding authority, croaked, "Enter." The door swung open to reveal two men and a woman in dark, functional suits. The lead detective, a man whose tired eyes had seen the end of 1,000 such stories, held up a badge and a folded document. "Detective Valerius, Greyhaven PD, Economic Crimes," he announced to the room at large. He then fixed his gaze on Mara. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Mara Voss." His voice was flat, devoid of drama. He was a functionary of the system, the endpoint of a long and complex equation. He began to read from the warrant, his words falling like stones into the silent room. "For conspiracy to commit wire fraud, for witness tampering, and for the obstruction of the execution of a testamentary document." All the fight, all the venom, seemed to drain from Mara at once. The corporate predator, the master manipulator, was gone. In her place was a woman suddenly and completely out of options. Her eyes, wide and desperate, flew to my father, who had remained a silent, frail spectator at the end of the table. She searched his face for a flicker of doubt, a sign of rescue, a final, miraculous pardon from the man whose empire she had tried to steal. She was looking for a husband, a protector. My father looked back at her. His expression was not one of anger or triumph, but of a profound, bottomless sorrow. Then, with a slow, deliberate finality, he closed his eyes. It was a door slamming shut in the last hallway of hope. A sob, dry and ragged, tore from Mara's throat. A female officer stepped forward, her movements gentle but firm. "Ma'am, please stand and place your hands behind your back." Mara complied, moving like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The officer produced a pair of handcuffs. There was a sharp metallic click as the first cuff closed around Mara's left wrist, then another click as the second one locked onto her right. In the sterile light of the boardroom, I could see it clearly. Where the ruby ring had been just last night, there was only a thin red scratch on her skin, now encircled by cold, unforgiving steel. As they led her away, a ghost in a gray dress. I turned back to the table. The aftershock of the arrest was still rippling through the room, but my work was just beginning. Caleb slid 3 documents and a pen in front of me. I picked up the pen without hesitation. The first was an interim order for the preservation of all records. My signature would prevent anyone from deleting the digital footprints I had followed through the dark. The second was an executive directive to freeze all assets and payments related to the Sycamore Fund and its associated shell companies. My signature cut the financial arteries of her entire conspiracy. The third was a company-wide memo, drafted by Caleb, announcing the establishment of an anonymous internal reporting channel, effective immediately, to be overseen by my office. My signature opened a door for anyone else who had been silenced or threatened. I signed each one with a clear, steady hand. Caleb watched me, then walked to the media console and retrieved his USB drive. He went to Detective Valerius, who had lingered by the door. "Detective," Caleb said, handing him the small, sealed evidence bag containing the SD card from the dashcam. "This is the original, unedited recording from last night. The chain of custody is intact." Valerius took the bag, his expression unchanged. Caleb then turned back and paused as he passed me. His voice was low, for my ears only. "Avery," he said, his gaze serious. "They will try to tell this story a different way. The press, her lawyers, they'll paint you as the villain, her as the victim. Don't let them rewrite this." It was the single most important piece of legal advice he could have given me. The audit was over, but the narrative was now the battleground. After they were all gone, the police, the board members, my father and his nurse, I stood and walked out of the silent boardroom. I didn't go to my office. I went to the executive restroom down the hall. Inside, the silence was absolute. I stood before the wide, polished mirror. Under the bright, shadowless lights, I leaned in. The cut on my lip was a thin, dark line. It was no longer swollen, no longer angry. I gently peeled back the corner of the small bandage I had applied that morning. The bleeding had stopped completely. The edges of the wound were already beginning to knit together, a faint promise of a scar. I took a fresh bandage from my purse and carefully covered it. The damage was contained. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the hall, the same view of the city from the conference room, but my perception of it had fundamentally changed. This morning, Greyhaven had been a silent map, an abstract landscape of power and ambition. Now, it was different. It was a grid, a network of clear, intersecting lines, of streets and avenues, of rules and consequences. It wasn't a silent map anymore. It was a system where everyone, eventually, had to drive in their own lane. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new message from my father. It contained only 5 words. "Sorry for being late." He wasn't apologizing for the last year. He was apologizing for the last decade, for not seeing, for not acting, for being late to the truth. It was the last debt he owed me, finally paid. My thumbs moved over the screen. My reply was even shorter. "I'm done." I put the phone away. I stood there for another moment, looking out at the city, at the quiet, orderly flow of traffic 19 floors below. The great, grinding noise of deceit and destruction had finally ceased. The frantic energy was gone. The tension dissipated. All that remained was a profound and cleansing quiet. It was the silence of a room where the paper shredder has just been turned off. Back in the boardroom, the silence was no longer tense, but hollowed out, like the aftermath of a detonation. Mr. Sterling of Harbour and Finch moved with the quiet reverence of an undertaker. He gathered the signed pages of my father's new will, tapped them into a neat, perfect stack, and placed them inside the pale blue folder. He then produced a small, circular red sticker and a heavy brass seal embossed with the firm's logo. He affixed the sticker over the folder's flap, placed a piece of vellum over it, and pressed down with the seal. The embossing left a deep, permanent impression. A wound of wax and paper that could not be reopened without showing evidence of tampering. He closed his briefcase over it with a soft, definitive snap. The old world was officially dead and buried. An hour later, the Temporary Governance Committee held its first and last meeting of the day. It wasn't in the grand boardroom, but in a small, functional glass cubicle on the executive floor. Only the chairman, Arthur Vance, and myself were physically present. Caleb Dorn attended via a secure video link, his face a calm, pixelated mask. Arthur, looking exhausted but relieved, started to clear his throat, ready to launch into a prepared statement about new beginnings and steady hands. I held up a single finger, cutting him off before he began. "There will be no victory speeches," I said. My voice was flat, not harsh. It was a statement of operational procedure. "There is nothing to celebrate. We have identified a systemic failure, and now we begin the repairs. That's all." Arthur blinked, then slowly nodded, a wave of understanding washing over his face. This wasn't a coronation, it was a decontamination. "Of course, Ms. Quinn, what are your first directives?" "Full cooperation with the district attorney's office, a hold on all non-essential executive expenditures, and a third-party forensic accounting firm, not our own, to audit the last 18 months. I'll have the engagement letter on your desk by noon. Caleb's image on the screen gave a single, approving nod. The meeting was over in under 3 minutes. Back at my own desk, no longer in the cramped office of internal controls, but the spacious, minimalist office that had been Mara's, I composed an email. The recipient was the all employees distribution list. The subject line was simply, "A message from the Temporary Governance Committee." The body of the email contained only 3 lines. Effective immediately. A temporary hold has been placed on all executive expense accounts pending a full review. Operations will continue as normal. A new confidential channel for reporting procedural and ethical concerns has been established. The link is below. There was no talk of new leadership, no inspiring vision, no mention of Mara. It was not a memo from a person. It was a patch note for a malfunctioning system. I hit send. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was a slow, silent descent. The doors were brushed steel, their surface muddled and indistinct. I watched my reflection as we passed each floor. It was a pale, blurry version of me, a ghost in a machine. I saw the small, neat bandage on my lower lip. The woman in the reflection was not smiling, nor was she frowning. She was simply balanced. The tiny fissure that had marked her face, the physical evidence of the company's rupture, was now covered, contained, closed. Level P2. The doors slid open. The air that greeted me was the same as the night before. Cool, damp, smelling of old concrete, tire rubber, and the lingering memory of rain. It was the exact same environment, but the composition had changed. One critical element was missing. The metallic tang of blood was gone. The scene was the same, but the crime had been purged from it. I walked to my car. The sound of my own sensible heels, a quiet, solitary rhythm. I unlocked the trunk. Inside, secured by straps, was a small, heavy-duty personal safe. I keyed in the combination, and the thick steel door swung open. From my briefcase, I removed the manila envelope, the one containing the printouts of the sycamore logs and the honeypot invoice. The evidence. It had served its purpose. Its job was done. I placed it inside the safe, laying it flat on the felt lining. It was a relic now, an artifact from a war that was already over. I swung the heavy door shut and turned the handle, the bolt sliding home with a satisfying, solid thud. As I closed the trunk, my phone chimed with a new text message. It was Caleb. The file tells its own story now. He was right. The evidence was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to the public record, to the courts, to the official narrative of the company. It would write its own history, a cold, factual account of fraud and failure. My role as its custodian was over. I typed my reply. Yes, and the story ends here. I slid the phone back into my pocket. My job was not to be the protagonist of the next chapter. My job was to ensure the integrity of the last one. I got into my car, the engine starting with a low, steady hum. I did not look back. The story was over. The audit was complete. It was time to close the books. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We're always curious to know where our listeners are tuning in from. So please drop a comment down below and let us know where in the world you're hearing this. We love to see how far these stories travel and to read your thoughts and feelings about Avery's journey. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support us, hit that hype button to help share this story with even more people. Your support means the world to us.